So for me, it is absolutely important to listen to somebody like Saeeda, and that's why the book is called Saeeda X, because it's not just that Saeeda. It is many millions of women around us in India right now who are picking up the load, who are taking care of their families, who are affected by their socio-political locations, but at the same time trying to survive. So it's very important that we start noticing these Saeedas around us. They have been invisibilized by the media, they have been invisibilized by the kind of masculine research or practices that exist around us, by the kind of sources which are all male in nature that exist around us. I hope that through the book, we at least start noticing how much women do around us for so little. Hi, I'm Neha Dixit. I'm an independent journalist. I've been looking at intersections of social justice, gender and politics in South Asia for the last 17 years. Most of my work has been long-form narrative and investigative in nature. I have done a number of reports on police brutality, human rights. I have looked at police encounters in North India, sanctioned by state governments. The last one was in UP. I've also looked at trafficking extensively. So that is human trafficking, not just for commercial sex exploitation or for labor, but also done by religious organizations or driven by religious doctrines, particularly the RSS and how they traffic children from the northeast for the purpose of indoctrination. I've also looked at clinical trials and particularly on the poor and the urban poor, and I've covered urban poverty extensively. So this is what I do. And I've just finished a book called The Many Lives of Saeeda X. The book looks at last 30 years of India through the eyes of an urban poor migrant Muslim woman in Delhi. So The Many Lives of Saeeda X looks at not just urban poverty, migration, displacement, gender, social justice, class or caste, but at the same time it looks at how all of these themes run parallel and how they have shaped India in the last 30 years. So why I started working on this book was I was working with a news channel in 2012 where a big corporate group had bought 37% shares in that news organization that I was working for. And we were told by the editorial team that from now on our target audience is going to be the urban rich. So which means any story that we are doing, any reporting that we are doing have to be for the urban rich target audience, which means that their prototype was a 35-year-old techie sitting in Bangalore. So when he comes back home, he should switch to this news channel, which means the branding of the show, the bulletin points, the reporting, the content, everything that we do should be liked by this 35-year-old Bangalore techie. So after this briefing, I was in the investigations team, so I was told that you guys stop doing the Jholawala stories that you're doing. There is no space for bleeding heart stories because the 35-year-old Bangalore techie, urban rich audience is not going to like it. So why don't you do stories or investigations on who are the rich kids racing fast cars in South Delhi? So I realized that I don't have the skills for it, and essentially I'm also very old school because we were taught that journalism is for public interest. And here you could see clearly how corporate political nexus was sort of taking over the mainstream media, where questions of marginalization, where questions of public interest were not on priority. So for me, I realized, okay, this is not the job for me. And thankfully, what had also happened was in 2012, the anti-rape movement happened. What that movement did was, for a lot of reporters like me, earlier the news organizations were very dismissive of stories on sexual violence or any even superficial story about gender. That stopped after the 2012 rape movement, because the newsrooms couldn't like dismiss that any longer. So I started working as an independent journalist because I just didn't have the skill to report on the rich. So that's one part. And once I started working as an independent journalist, I realized that there was scope to do more stories on sexual violence. So one of the few stories that I had done initially was in September 2013, when the Muzaffarnagar riots happened in North India, where almost 100,000 people were displaced. A lot of them were working class Muslims. So I had written reports on sexual violence during those riots. But what was very sort of important to me and to learn was that a lot of women had not even told their families that this had happened with them. But the ones who, only 7 women came out and filed cases and sort of openly talked about what they faced. But after those cases, they had to go back and work in the same farms of the accused, because they were essentially farm laborers. And so that's where this whole idea sort of stood with me, because we talk about, suddenly everybody was talking about sexual violence. But the reporting is just around one event of sexual violence or one event of communal riots. But what happens to people before or after these episodes is something that I wanted to understand. So in the next one or 2 years, I realized that everything that I was reporting around sexual violence, for example, one story I had done was on a Dalit woman who was imprisoned for 10 days for perjury because she withdrew her statement in the court on the sexual violence that she had faced. And the backstory to it was that because she was from the Dhanuk community and she was a Dalit woman, the accused were from the Jat community, the dominant community in that village. So the Khap Panchayat decided that nobody from the Dhanuk community will be given work if she does not withdraw her case. And Dhanuks were essentially farm laborers. So again, it came back to, okay, you are anyway a woman and from a marginalized community, but on top of that, there is sexual violence and there is a life that you need to navigate before and after. So, and then there were many other stories. One more example I wanted to add was that I had spoken to an Adivasi woman from Mirzapur, and she basically spoke about how she was raped and she was pregnant, but because she worked in a mining quarry, she couldn't afford to take a day off to get an abortion done. So essentially, why I'm talking about this is because it were these reporting assignments which actually pushed me to understand, or even attempt to understand, what is the life of a working class woman who's anyway marginalized because of their religion or because of their class or because of their tribe or their race or geographical location. But what is the full story? So that's why I started visiting a number of industrial areas in Delhi. Unlike Kolkata and Bombay, where you have large industrial units, in Delhi, the master plan ruled it out. So which is why Delhi has a number of small and medium manufacturing units in various parts. And we have a number of industrial cities or areas also around Delhi. So I started visiting these areas where while I was researching, I found out about a protest that was staged by workers who would clean and package almonds in 2009 in Karawal Nagar. And so their protest was about a raise of 10 rupees because they were paid 40 rupees to clean a 23 kg bag, and they were paid, the payments were always delayed, and this work took almost 12 to 16 hours every day. They had to peel it with their hands and package it. And all these almonds were essentially going to the Western world. So companies like California Almonds and all of that, they were essentially sending all their stuff here, which was being peeled, pruned, packaged, and then sent back to the Western world. And the people who were actually the contractors or subcontractors for the same bag were getting 1700 rupees, where these women were getting like 40 rupees. So essentially they staged this protest in 2009. It was one of the largest protests of unorganized labor in Delhi. And they did manage to get a raise of 10 rupees, which may seem very small, but for them it was really important because it sort of made it possible for the people working in the unorganized sector and informal economy to think of how they can demand for better, which is not taken into account by any organized trade union or any organized work on labor rights. And that protest also managed to raise the global rates for almonds that year. That's when I started meeting a lot of women. So I'm talking about 2014, 5 years after the strike. I started meeting the women who were part of this. And then that's how I came in touch with Saeeda and many other people mentioned in the book. So the book took 9 years to finish. It is made and it is constructed out of the conversations and interviews I've done with 900 people over the span of these 9 years. Why I stuck with Saeeda was because initially I was speaking to many women, but after 4-5 years of talking to her, one realized that everything that she is speaking about is sort of tracing the history of India in the last 30 years. And particularly in the last 10 years, because the kind of majoritarianism that we see, the kind of Brahminical politics that is dominant and is supported by the central government is what we see. And here is a person who's really on the margins of the margin and trying to survive and facing the consequences of what is happening high up. So Saeeda, for example, was a weaver in Banaras in the 90s. Her loom was burnt down after the Babri Masjid demolition. And after that is when she decided to move to Delhi in 1995. And since 1995 till 2020, where the book ends, is where every once in a while her life is affected by the fact that she's a working class Muslim woman living in the national capital, and nobody thinks that what is the consequence of something that is decided as an ideology high up and how it affects people on the ground. So for Saeeda, her life was not just affected because of her religious identity, but it was also affected by her class or caste position in this situation. And the fact that she is very much part of the national capital, which is always spoken about in terms of its rulers, right? So we keep hearing about Delhi ka khana or Delhi ka Mughal rule, ya fir people, the government in Delhi or the ministers in Delhi or the Lutyens Delhi that people speak about, but not through the eyes of the 35,000 migrants who come to Delhi every day and never go back. Saeeda was one of them. So there were so many things to talk about through Saeeda's story, and that's why I decided to stick with her. That's why I decided to talk about not just her, but also in a generational fashion, how her life was affected and how that shaped the life of her children. There was a report that came out in 2008 called the Arjun Sen Gupta report that looked at, that was actually the first time a report that acknowledged the existence of home-based workers in India. Because a lot of NSSO surveys also were unable to put on the record what is the kind of work that women do to earn a living. Home-based workers, according to the ILO, are people who receive work and are paid on a per piece basis. There could be a subcontractor, contractor, supplier, exporter involved in the chain. So somebody like Saeeda, for example, she used to make all these, it was really interesting because as a home-based worker, she would keep track of what all festivals and calendars are in the play or what all events are happening. For example, within a year, starting from making New Year confectionery to things for Holi, making prayer rugs for Ramzan, making string lights for Diwali, making marigold garlands for other festivals, or during elections making election material like party flyers or keychains or flags. All these things, or the fact that each time there was World Cup, she was very excited because the multinational companies would actually outsource that work to a home-based worker through a contractor or a subcontractor. So in this case, for example, during the football World Cup, each time she had to stitch the hexagonal patches of leather into a ball. Then she used to get like 8 rupees per ball she stitched. And Reshma, many years later, when she started working in a mall, she realized that everything that her mother makes at home are the things that are sold in the mall. Why I'm talking about this is because apart from Saeeda's Muslim identity, what is also very important is that home-based worker is essentially work mostly taken up by women. In this case, Saeeda, but many other women. Also, what is very important is the fact that a lot of times while working on this book, when I was asking women, do you work? So they were home-based worker, but they would never acknowledge that they were workers because a lot of times their families don't know that they are workers. The other times when they would answer, they would say, नहीं काम करते हैं मगर दूध का पैसा या सब्जी का पैसा निकाल लेते हैं. So in such a situation, whether you are a Muslim woman or a Dalit woman or an Adivasi woman or anyone who's working as a home-based worker, when you don't even have the confidence to acknowledge that you're a worker, how do you ask for better wages? Home-based workers also get just 1/5 of the daily wage. So this is why Saeeda's life is very important, because we are not just talking about her as a Muslim woman or displaced because of communal violence, but we also need to understand that the conversation about majoritarianism or communalism is not successful till we start marrying questions of class, caste, gender. That's absolutely important. Also, what is essential to understand is that women's labor, where there is always understanding of, that a lot of things that you are doing is something that you want to do or you're good at. Why do you need to receive equal wages? Why should we address gender pay gap? And that's also the attitude of a lot of unions that may look at class but may not look at other identities like your religious identity or your caste identity or your gender identity that plays a role in the kind of payment you get or the kind of work you get. So in the book, I have spoken to a lot of women and written about them. So this is Saeeda's world. There are lots of women in this world. There is a person called Lalita who was a Musahar from Bihar, and after Ranveer Sena's threat, Ranveer Sena was an upper caste militia, she had to move to Delhi. Now Lalita's story is very important because there is social mobility in her life, but at the same time every day she's struggling to meet the needs of her child, meet the needs of her son. And so in Lalita's family, her husband disapproves her working outside the house. And so how Lalita negotiates that world by bonding with all these other women, including Saeeda, to make sure that she manages to go out and work in those sweatshops which they call factories, or get that work home and work from home. But her husband does not come to know. So there is that. In Saeeda's case, that's not really the case, because her husband, who was also a very skilled weaver from Banaras, after the Babri Masjid demolition riots and her loom being burnt down, Akmal was jailed. And so his struggle from that point till now, in the 30 years that he spent in Delhi, where the only job that he could get was of a cart rickshaw puller. So from being an extremely skilled but moody, but also having the kind of expertise to make a particular kind of Banarsi weave, to becoming a cart rickshaw puller. So that also has consequences, because here there are questions of masculinity. Here there are questions of upholding the patriarchal honor, but also at the same time being a working class Muslim man in this situation, having faced police brutality, having faced state discrimination by the state on the basis of your religion. He is dealing with those questions constantly and finding himself incapable of finding full-time work, or even when he does it, he can't sustain it for too long. And why I'm talking about this is because this is also a story of of masculinity. Because here there is you are a man from the margins. You're always being pushed against the wall because of your identity, whether it's your religious identity in present India or your caste identity. And then you also want to, because as a man, you've been conditioned to have a higher sense of self-worth. So what happens is that if other people are getting 300 rupees for their job, in most situations, the men that I spoke to in Karaval Nagar would not take that work. But women, because they were so desperate to bring food to the table, and because of course there's patriarchal conditioning where you're supposed to take care of your children and make sure that they eat, these women would take up any work that came their way. So that's why the question is not just about doing lowly paid work or unpaid work or getting abysmal wages, but there are also questions of how your world shapes up because of your caste, class, gender positioning in this society in contemporary India. There are again number of small and medium manufacturing units. There are also sweatshops, jo home-based workers call them factory, but they're not technically factories. So which is why, for example, an almond factory where people go and work, because it's illegal in structure, women have to enter through a window, be there, work in that almond dust for 15-16 hours, which also impacts their lungs and everything, and then they come out. This is the world of Karaval Nagar, where also in Saeeda's life, she's seen number of Hindu supremacist organizations changing their character or changing their motto every once in a while. So for example, there is a Hindu Kanya Raksha Front that becomes a Gau Raksha Front, and then later becomes a Unite Hindu Front. So it's always interchangeable. So it's really funny to me the fact that you can, for the Hindu right wing, you can always, and actually all religious dogma where they constantly undermine the intelligence of a woman. In this case, Saeeda's son Shahzeb, he falls in love with a Hindu Gujar woman, and how that completely becomes or is manufactured into an episode of love jihad, which according to me is, I keep saying this, is the best example of mansplaining, because you think women have such low level of intelligence that if you flash your cell phone or a bike, you are able to make them fall in love with you. And of course, it's Hindu right-wing propaganda. So Shahzeb was accused of that by Hindu Kanya Raksha Front, which later on became Gau Raksha Front. Why I'm talking about this is because one needs to understand that this is a world where the men mostly are not working. It is the women who are trying to earn a pittance and take care of their families. Initially, when I was going and meeting people in these areas, I saw how everybody in the evening would make basically aloo ki sabzi in oil, do one tadka in oil and have aloo ki sabzi with roti. In the last 2-3 years, I've been seeing that because the cost of living has gone up, because there is inflation, because edible oil is so expensive, I've seen people basically boiling potatoes and putting a few drops of oil when they're serving that food to their children. So the kind of deprivation, the kind of survival that people have to do on a daily basis how then are we talking about the larger political issues that are ailing the country as of now? We're talking about, for somebody like Saeeda, often when I've spoken to her, and because she was twice affected in a major way, or actually multiple times because of the Hindu right-wing politics, when I asked her what is it that she thinks about, and one day she said that, when I wake up, I don't think about how to defeat Hindu supremacists. I think about how to bring food on the table. And why I talk about this really stood out to me was that if you are always forcing people to engage or to only think about how to survive that day, how does anyone gather the energy to talk about the larger things that are ailing them and to resist them or to fight them and to be able to defeat them? This is the reality of India, and Karaval Nagar actually, with the number of labor rights, working class issues and displacements and everything that we are speaking about, and the larger majoritarianism that exists in India, and the kind of socio-economic marginalization that exists in India, is actually representing what is ailing people these days. So through this book, what I essentially wanted to also do was to talk about a gender lens that needs to exist when we are having conversations about things. Why to me this was important is because each time when I have done a story on police encounters where people from minority community or from socio-economic margins are targeted. So when the man is killed by the police, who is the one who actually takes up responsibility to follow up in the court or become the primary breadwinner of the family? I have seen situations where if there were riots and people have died, the breadwinners have died in the family, it's again the women who are taking up the responsibility. So a lot of times when these conversations happen about the larger politics that sort of are shaping the country right now, there is always a lot of the voices are all masculine. So you will speak to a male police officer, you will speak to a male mantri, you will speak to a male expert, but it's actually the women who are picking up the load and doing things. I hope that through the book we at least start noticing how much women do around us for so little.